Rashi tells us, as does the Medrash, as does the Sifri, as does the Gemara, that Hashem rewarded the Jewish midwives in Egypt for saving and looking after the Jewish babies when Paro had told them to, God forbid, kill them. Question is, what is the kind of reward that would satisfy a righteous Jewish mother? It's Rashi's insight that helps us appreciate what exactly that reward was and how it is midah keneged midah, perfectly suited to the sacrifice that they made. Even pasuk vayihi ki yoram yaldas Yisrael yikem vayaslem. But the pasuk tells us that when the midwives showed their fear of Hashem, Hashem made homes for them. State in Gemara Sota. We'll first start with the Gemara Sota, which is well known. Rav or Shmuel, there's a debate between Rav and Shmuel. Who exactly is this referring to and what were they given? Chad Omar Bota Kihuna Levia. One opinion is that the houses the Eibusha gave them were houses of Kohanim and Levi, which would be their legacy. Whereas the other says royalty would be their legacy. The one who says that the reward was houses of Kohanim and Levim, that's because their children would be, Yocheved's children would be Moshe and Aaron. And the one who says their legacy would be kingship, that's because David also traces his lineage to Miriam, who was one of the midwives. That's the Gemara. Let's have a look at the Sifri. In Sifri wird gesagt, Botim elu einu yadam ahem. I don't know what houses here the Torah is referring to. Then Keshehu Omer, much later on in the book of Melachim, where it says about Shlomo HaMelech after he completed building the Beis HaMikdash, after 20 years that Shlomo HaMelech built the two houses. Which ones? Es Beis Hashem, the house of Hashem, which the Sifri says Zoi Kohuna refers to building the house of Kohanim, and then the pasuk continues Ves Beis HaMelech, and his own palace, says the Sifri Zoi HaMalchus, that refers to building a lineage of kings. Zochse Yocheved likehuna umirim, the Malchus, says the Sifri, very similar to the Gemara. Yocheved built the lineage of Kahuna and Miriam the lineage of kings. Now let's see Rashi. If you said Hashem b'Pirish Rashi b'Parashat, actually what Rashi says leaves us questioning. He quotes those words, Vayaslem Batim, and his Mefarsh explains that it means this: Bate Kehuna uLevia uMalchus. It is houses of Kohanim and Leviim and kingship. Shakruim Batim. They're all called houses. How do we know this? Quotes that pasuk. Vayiven es Beis Hashem es Beis HaMelech, that Shlomo HaMelech built the house of the king and the house of Hashem and the house of the king. Kehuna uLevia Yocheved uMalchus Miriam. Kehuna and Levia was the lineage of Yocheved. Kingship is the lineage of Malchus, Miriam. Kidei Yiseb and Masechah Sota, and he says you can see that in the Gemara Sota. Was von ein Zeit bringt Rashi. That sounds like Rashi is actually making a contradictory comment over here, because on the one hand he says Aleph Sai Kahuna und Sai Malchus. He speaks about both Kahuna and Malchus via Sifri, which is the way the Sifri proposed it, as opposed to the Gemara that had two opinions, either Kahuna or Malchus. On Hivi Gemara was doesn't say it like in the Gemara that there's two opinions. And then the pasuk, he quotes the pasuk, Es Beis Hashem, Es Beis HaMelech, was bringt sich in Sifri, aber nicht in Gemara. He quotes the pasuk from Melachim, which is the pasuk that the Sifri brings. The Gemara doesn't quote this pasuk. Then Gimel Ezak Kuhuno Levia Mi Yocheved. Then he tells us that the lineage of Kohanim and Leviim comes from Yocheved and Malchus Miriam, and the lineage of kings comes from Miriam, also V in Sifri. So it sounds very much like Rashi's based his commentary on Sifri, neat V in Gemara, and completely different to the Gemara. Was es nicht mehr forward von Vemen Kohuna Levia seinen Ares gekommen? Because the Gemara doesn't tell us who the mothers of Kohuna and of kingship were. No, it's forward Ver Kohuna Levia Malchus seinen. Actually, all the Gemara told us was who were the people who would be the heads of those households. But Kohuna Levia, Aaron and Moshe, that according to the opinion that it's referring to Kahuna and Levia, it's referring to Aaron and Moshe. Mandoma Bata Malchus, David Name Miriam Kasi, and the one that says that it's also the lineage of kings, that's because David HaMelech also traces back to Miriam. In other words, focusing on the people who are the heads of those households, not their mothers. So Rashi seems very aligned with the Sifri. Yet Rashi leaves a bombshell at the end of his Pirush where he says, Kidesa b'Masechta Sota, like quoted in Sota, Nit Kidesa b'Sifri, rather than telling us from the Sifri. So Rashi words his commentary like the Sifri and then quotes back to the Gemara in Sota, which does not seem to make sense. We'll deal with the first question quite easily by saying, well, depends which view you go with in the Gemara, right? The first question that we asked is, Rashi is speaking about houses of Kahuna, Levia, and Malchus, yet the Gemara said either or, depending on which view you go with. In the Machlekes von Rav Shmuel in Gemara. So that we can resolve by looking what the commentaries tell us about the debate in the Gemara, particularly the Maharsha. as Z is totally in the Friedrich Prukta for Rabbi Shmuel and Gemara Dort. This debate between Rabbi and Shmuel about who were the houses of that were given, in other words, was it Kahuna Levia or was it Malchus? That's directly related to the preceding debate between Rabbi Shmuel, Dort Verdim Yalda Zayin Given, which is an argument about who were the midwives. One opinion says it's a mother and daughter, Yocheved and Miriam. And the other opinion says that it was a mother and daughter-in-law. If it's a mother and daughter, it's Yocheved and Miriam. Whereas the opinion that says that it's a mother and daughter-in-law, it was Yocheved and Elisheva, not that Elisheva was necessarily her daughter-in-law yet at that point. So Leute, der Kalvachamoy says, Batikunim Elisheva, Ishta Sha'arnan, Batilevia von Yocheved. So therefore, the opinion who says that it was a mother and daughter-in-law is the opinion who says what was the legacy? Kahuna and Levia. Kahuna from Elisheva, who married Aaron, and Levia from Yocheved. Whereas the other opinion that says that it was a mother and daughter, that's the opinion that would highlight that there's a lineage of kings here as well, but Levia from Yocheved and Malchus from Miriam, because there would be the possibility of the lineage of Kahuna and Levia from Yocheved and of the kingship from Miriam. Now Rashi's already told us who he believes the midwives to be. He goes with a view that there was a mother and daughter, Yocheved and Miriam. Yocheved and Miriam is kumtois as batim is batim Kahuna Levia un batim Malchus. So therefore, it would make sense that Rashi takes the view that there were two lineages, actually three lineages, Kahuna, Levia, and Malchus, and that would be perfectly fine. So we could resolve that apparent distinction between Rashi's quote from the Sifri and what the Gemara actually says. But we still have the big question. The other questions about the pasuk that he quotes, and the main one, the fact that Rashi specifically says, as it says in Sota, even though he seems to base his commentary on Sifri, that Afal Piva says Mosif derived from pasuk was Brenzach and Sifri, even though Rashi is basing himself on the pasuk which is quoted by Sifri, and also uses the words of the Sifri that the lineage of Kahuna comes from Yocheved, which is completely different to the Gemara that focused on the heads of those households. Aaron, the father of Kohanim, Moshe, the father of Leviim. So why is it that Rashi seems to give us a hodgepodge of commentary over here, quoting the Sifri and then telling us to look in the Gemara? Also, a few other questions we have to look at. Let's specifically home in for a second on the question of the source that Rashi brings to illustrate to us that houses over here refers to houses of Kahuna and houses of Malchus from the pasuk of Shlomo HaMelech building a house for Hashem, the Beis Hamikdash, and his own palace. Aleph, Rashi taishtach vayaslem botim. Listen to how Rashi explains the words that Hashem made for these midwives houses. Nit botim kipshute abinyan. Rashi's not translating that as physical structures, actual physical houses. No, botim he's talking about legacies or lineage, the line of kohanim or of royalty. In other words, Rashi is interpreting the word bias in this pasuk as households, lineages, families. Why then quote the pasuk in Melachim, which actually seems to disagree with what Rashi is saying? He's talking about a pasuk where the Torah is telling us, the Tanakh is telling us about how Shlomo HaMelech built an actual structure called the Beis Hamikdash and an actual structure called his palace. So how could that prove to us that batim means families and legacies? Number two, Beis, there are so many other choices that Rashi could have used to prove that batim means families or legacies. First of all, we can find psukim that speak about the legacy or the line of Kohanim and Levim as a house. Beis Aaron Baruch Hashem, Beis Alevi Baruch Hashem. We know clearly that that pasuk continuum is not talking about a physical house with Kohanim inside it or a physical house with Levim inside it. No, Bais Memuven Fundi Meshpacha. It's referring to the family, the lineage. The Meshpacha from Kahuna and the Meshpacha from Levia. The family of Kohanim, the family of Levim. Why didn't Rashi rather bring that pasuk to prove his point that batim means legacies and families of Kohanim, Levim, and royalty? And by batim Malchus, if you don't believe that you could use the word bias to refer to a lineage of kings, here's the proof. The pasuk says that David HaMelech should have a established house of royalty. Beis HaMelech Hazinu, as the pasuk says, that Hosea says, "Listen up, house of royalty." Shimon Beis David. This is Yeshayahu Navi when he's speaking to Achaz, and he says, "Listen up, house of David." He's referring to the royal house, not to the actual physical structure. Or Beis David Chelek, as the pasuk says, that the house of David will be like Hashem. Was in die alle Erde meint Beis, nicht Beis Gashmi. None of those psukim is referring to a physical structure, physical building, not Beis Mishpachas HaMelech, but rather to the family structure, the lineage. Einfach was bringt in Rashi out die psukim. Why doesn't Rashi use any of those psukim that would have served his purpose? Wo Beis meint nicht Kipshutoi, where the word Beis doesn't mean a physical house. Those psukim would have illustrated that Batim refers to legacies, the lineage of royalty, the lineage of holiness of the Kohanim and the Levim. Why didn't he bring those psukim? And Gimel, the other thing is interesting. It's actually going to be the easiest answer for us to resolve. In Rashi Shelefaneinu state Vayiven es Beis Hashem es Beis HaMelech. The way Rashi proposes the pasuk is, and Vayiven, he built the house of Hashem and the house of the king. The Lashon pasuk is Abanita, so that's not how the pasuk says it. In pasuk shtei kanal asher bona Shlomo eshnei batim es Beis Hashem es Beis HaMelech. It says that Shlomo had built the house of Hashem and the house of his palace. It doesn't say Vayiven. Where did Rashi get that from? As I say, that would be the easiest answer for us to deal with. So the bir bozeh, we have to understand what Rashi's intention is. The raya was Rashi bring from pasuk es Beis Hashem es Beis HaMelech. The reason Rashi quotes that particular pasuk, that Shlomo HaMelech built the house of Hashem and the house of royalty, is nicht als der Wort Bayis wird genitzt auf Bote Kahuna Levia bemoven from Mishpacha Kahuna Levia Chole. Rashi is not using that pasuk to prove to us that a bayis is not only a physical house, but it is also a household or a lineage. Wie bei den Psukim Beisarim, Beisalevi, Baruch Hashem, Gomer, like the other Psukim might have done. Rashi doesn't have to tell us that because in them is ken chiddush nita. The fact that the Torah will use the word bias and it's not only referring to a structure but it's also referring to a household is not news to us. But Rashi's already told us in Parshas Vayigash, as bias meant oich avod of uvnei beisoi, that when the word bias is used in Torah, it could also include a person's staff and the members of the family. Nit not bias mamish, and is not locked into only meaning a physical house. In fact, that's something that is repeated numerous times in the Torah. Rashi doesn't have to prove that to us. We already know before we learn Rashi that the word bias could be literal or it could be conceptual. So why is Rashi quoting that pasuk from Elohim? The raya was Rashi bringt do is if dem as b'shas steht the loshen botim stam. Rashi is pointing out something else to us. In that pasuk it says that he built Beis Hashem and Beis HaMelech, teaching us that when the word bias is used without a qualifier, without an adjective, need ois teichentik wegen welchen bias es retzich. Rashi wants us to know that the Torah will sometimes use the word bias without a qualifier, saying Beis HaLevi or Beis HaMelech. Ken das mene bote kuna Levi or Malchus. Rashi's point over here is because our pasuk says batim without assigning it to a particular lineage, and Rashi wants us to know that it could still refer to a lineage. Vi Rashi is mamshich shekruim batim in pasuk verbrengt di raya ha batim es Beis Hashem es Beis HaMelech. That's why Rashi wants this pasuk, because this pasuk says ha batim, their houses, without designating at that point what those houses are. And then the Torah tells us when we said ha batim without a particular qualifier, we meant the house of Hashem and the house of the king. Therefore, you should now know that the Torah could use the word batim without a specific definition, and we would know that it refers to a household, not just any household, but a special lineage in Judaism, either the holy lineage of Kohanim and Levim or the royal lineage of Malchus. Rashi. And that actually should be how it's written in Rashi. There was a printing error or a copying error that happened at some point in Rashi. Ha batim anstot vayiven. Instead of saying the word vayiven, which is how the print in most Rashis is today, it should actually say the word ha batim, and maybe whoever was copying it thought that the word ha batim was in the wrong place, and therefore, and maybe it was abbreviated at some point, and he misunderstood the abbreviation, because the word vayiven, we see in Tfusei Rashi, is a to'us von matik. The word vayiven, as it appears in Rashi currently, is a mistake. The loshen eshnei batim stam was the pasuk leg dorten zu. But the pasuk that says ha batim, without telling us what batim, Taish the pasuk gleich up as das meint Beis Hashem as Beis HaMelech. Immediately after saying the word, the Torah, the Tanakh will qualify what the batim are, Beis Hashem and Beis HaMelech. Over Mela, that will teach us is moving as the word batim stam steht in a pasuk. That will illustrate to us that when you have the word batim in a pasuk without a particular designation, meint euch bate kahuna levia umalchus, it is likely that it refers to special households or lineages like kahuna, levia, and royalty. Was der Fall is considering it das was dort meint bottom Beis Hashem Beis HaMelech bottom kipshutan. So it doesn't bother us the fact that in that particular context the description bias was talking about a physical house or a physical palace. Makes no difference. But da is Rashi no oisen as bottom stam meint, because Rashi is not trying to explain that bottom doesn't only mean physical structures. Rather, he's trying to explain that when the word bottom is used in the Torah without a particular designation, it probably refers to one of the great lineages of the Jewish people. Once again, could either be a physical house, like in the pasuk there. The physical house belongs to Hashem, and the other physical house belongs to the king. So one is the holy house, one is the royal house. Or it could refer to families, and the word bottom could equally refer to families. And again, it will either be referring to a lineage of holiness, Kohanim and Levim, or a lineage of royalty, the kings. The question that we do still have to answer is, what is forcing us in the simple interpretation of the pasuk? Where is the clue in the pasuk that the word bottom over here must refer to the royal house or the houses of Kohanim and Levim? Maybe it's much more generic, that it's talking about households in the broadest sense. From word bottom umetum, which would be the most typical way that you translate the word bottom normally, and actually that's what quite a number of the meforshim on this pasuk actually say. So we'll use two of those examples. One is Aleph, as the Eibishter hat for sie aufgestellt bottom kedei bashitzen und ratven sie from Paroi. The one explanation which the Even Ezra brings is, Vayastem bottom means that the Eibishter afforded them houses where they could actually be safe from Paroi, who wanted to punish them for keeping the Jewish kids alive. So maybe bottom just means houses. That's pshat, that's the simplest way. Why doesn't Rashi use that? Or Beis, as bottom domained bonim mishpoches. Or you could go with the opinion which is brought in a whole lot of different meforshim, which is that the word bottom over here means that the reward for the dedication of these midwives is that the Eibishter allowed them to build their own homes, their own families. And das ist gewähnt das Schar von dem Yaldes Farvat Chayanes Hayeladim, which would make a lot of sense, because they helped keep other people's children alive. Therefore, the Eibishter rewarded them that they should have children and families of their own. Because they helped birth the Jewish children and they helped establish Jewish families, so therefore the midah keneged midah, the appropriate, commensurate reward for them would be to be able to establish their own families. Surely those two explanations are far more aligned with the simple understanding of the pasuk than what Rashi is doing, saying that Batim refers to lineages and telling us which lineage. Kuna and Levia from Yocheved, Malchus from Miriam. Say it simply, they had houses to live in so they could be safe, and they had families of their own. And why is it closer to the pshat? If we go over the first explanation, it's much closer to pshat because we're translating houses as houses. Doesn't get more pshat than that. Other gashmistika batim, either literally physical houses, or the mishpachas, and even if you translate it as families, that's language that is common in the Torah, and it's still closer to the pshat. And we don't have to get into the detail of exactly which lineage and family are we talking about, which would then force us to go shopping elsewhere in Tanakh to find a pasuk in Melachim to justify it. Why doesn't Rashi just stick with the simplest explanation? And Beis, don't you think that the word vayas, that the Eibishter made, past tense, homes for them, is better aligned with what we've just offered as two potential translations? That at that point in time, or even perhaps before, the Eibishter already gave them their homes. Whereas Rashi's interpretation says, what is the vayas, and Hashem made homes for them? Something that's only going to happen in the future, and not even in the immediate future. Und Malchus David is gekommen mit Kama Dorish Speter, because one of the options, according to Rashi, is the royal home, David HaMelech, that's centuries down the line. How do you fit that with the word Vayas in the past tense? So why is Rashi forced to give us an explanation that Batim means over here these legacies, instead of just saying simply homes or families? So the Bir Bozeh, the explanation is this. The Pirush Rashi soil the mitvos Rashi zog dem Pirush besmichus of a hemshach zufriedenen pasuk. The first thing Rashi pays attention to is, let's see the context. This pasuk follows a preceding pasuk which says, or Pirush, Vayetev elikim lamiyaldus. The pasuk says that the Eibusha did good to the midwives. Says Rashi, Mahu hatova. What was the good that he did for them? So Rashi links that pasuk to the next pasuk. Vayaslem batim, he gave them homes. On his matik eich deverta vayaslem, and Rashi includes the words vayaslem in that commentary. Was damit kommt nicht nur vor sein, oi was der vayete batzitzich. Rashi is not only linking what is the goodness Hashem showed to Miriam and Yocheved, let's go with that opinion, which is Rashi's opinion. It's not just linking it because it's in the next pasuk and you need to know that Vayetev actually refers to the next pasuk. By Rashi alerting us to that link, Vayetev, that the Eibush is doing something uniquely good for them, something special for them, that helps us to understand what Vayaslem Batim is actually going to mean. In other words, if the pasuk will gemeint has der Eibush hat für gemacht binyonim zu beschützen und matzel sein sie, let's go with the first interpretation. That what does Batim mean? The Eibush gave them houses so they could be safe from Paro's tentacles. Okay. Don't you think the Torah would have used a word like Vayiven, the Eibush built houses for them, instead of Vayas, which is not normally a word that you'd associate with the construction of a house? Vayasi made a house for them? No, he built a house for them. Beis pasnit that in from Vayetev. The pasuk is saying Vayetev, the Eibush did something unusually good for them. If all he did was provided them with shelter, that should be something which adds goodness to their life. Not just something that removes something negative from their life. Protection is not good. Protection is necessary. Good implies a brocha, something beyond what you expected. Similarly, if the Pirush is as a if we go with the second interpretation, which is Batim means that they had families of their own, what's the big brocha in that? Don't you remember what period of history we're talking about? Even before they volunteered to protect the Jewish babies, that was a time of population explosion amongst the Jewish people. What's the special bracha to Yocheved and Miriam that they'll have children at a time where everybody's having massive families? That's why Rashi is dissatisfied with either one of those explanations being the Vayetev, the special goodness and grace that Hashem showed to Yocheved and Miriam. The Rebbe lent Rashi as bottom domenta spezielle tova. Therefore, Rashi concludes that the word bottom over here must mean something unique, something special. Bote kehuna ulevia umalchus. What is special? To build a legacy. What kind of a legacy? The legacy of kings, the legacy of kohanim, Levim. Nicht stam haben sie aufgestellt wie alle den Mishpoches. Not just that they had a family, like all the other Jewish people were blessed with a family. Not von sie seinen Areis gekommen botim, but that their families became legacies. Yes, something far more powerful and great. Bote kehuna ulevia umalchus. Unique legacies that are everything to the Jewish people. Now, because that's how Rashi is explaining it, that the whole message over here is that David gave them a special bracha of something really, really unique, that's why Rashi takes us back to the Gemara Sota. Even though his explanation is very much aligned with the Sifri, there's something about the Gemara Sota that's relevant to us understanding what's going on here. In order for Rashi to drive home what is so special about this view and interpretation, is Rashi Metzayin Kedissim and Masechah Sota. That's why Rashi refers to the Gemara Sota. He's not just telling us where it is so we know the base of Rashi's commentary, because maybe his basis is actually more the Sifri. It's because he wants to answer a question, a very important question about what's happening here. Because if we're going to say that their reward was houses of safety or families, it's the Schar Vayastem Botim in Guf Ha'inyan, and we see the link. What they're being rewarded with is aligned with the sacrifice they made. Like Nershem Pirish Kedei Bashitz and say from Paroi. The first explanation is to protect them from Paroi. Well, that's obvious because Paroi is now breathing down their backs because they're saving babies. They need that protection. It fits the context of the story. Pshita, like in Sveiten Pirish, and certainly the second explanation as Botim means they're bonim umishpochis, that Botim means that they were given the bruch of establishing their own families, Mida Keneged Mida Kanal, then that suits their avoida. They helped build families, therefore they were rewarded with families. It makes sense. Like Pirish Rashi Ober, whereas if you take Rashi's perspective, as Eschar is Botikunu Levio Malchus, where the reward that they're being given is that they are going to start these tremendously important legacies of Jews. It sounds like the reward is not specifically aligned with what they were engaged in. There doesn't seem to be any correlation between the reward that the Eibishter is giving them, even though it's a beautiful and great reward, with what they did to help keep the children alive. To resolve that issue, Rashi refers us to the Gemara Seita. What is the context in which the Gemara is talking about the reward for Yocheved and Miriam? It's in part of a greater conversation, the Mishnah that tells us the measure or the conduct of a person is matched with the reward or consequence from Hashem. And then the Gemara goes into detail. The Gemara goes through a whole lot of detail about, even the Mishnah does, about Mida Keneged Mida. Some of them are positive rewards, some of them are negative consequences. What the Gemara makes clear is that the response from the Eibishter matches the exact conduct of the person. Now that we know that the Gemara there is talking about how what the Eibishter gives us matches our conduct absolutely. Rashi is using that to help us understand what is so special about the bracha to Yocheved and Miriam that they would start these legacies of kahuna, levia, and royalty. In other words, Rashi is not just showing us how great their reward was going to be, but by referring us to Soita, he's showing us how what the Eibush is giving them is absolutely perfectly calibrated to suit in every detail what they had done for the Jewish people. The reward matches their behavior. Why? Because their behavior was not just to save a group of people. Die Pula von dem Yaldis in dem, was Batchayenes Hayelodim is given, the achievement of these midwives by keeping the children alive, is nicht nur das, was sie haben durch dem geholfen, es sollen aufgestellt werden jüdische Mishpachos. It wasn't simply that they ensured there would be Jewish families. Durch dem hat sich aufgestellt der Rabbi oder ganze der Yotze Mitzrayim, von wenn es kommt da ist ganz am Yisrael hat seif kol aderes. They were ensuring the people who would leave Mitzrayim, all of them, certainly most of them, and as a result, they were ensuring the sustainability of the entire Jewish nation until the end of history. Und der Rebbe is the Scharboi von der Mida Keneged Mida beprotius. Therefore, they needed a reward, not just that they'd have a family of their own. That wouldn't match what they did. They didn't just save families. They built the entire Jewish nation, therefore they need a reward that is relevant to the entire Jewish nation. It's not good enough just to reward them that they should have families. It wouldn't even be good enough for them to have families who are great people. Kings, Kohanim, Leviim. They built the entire Jewish nation. Therefore, they were going to be the ones who would build legacies of the most important streams in the Jewish nation, royalty and holiness. They built the entire Jewish people until the end of time, and the Eibishter rewarded them with the most important streams of who would lead the Jewish people until the end of time. And that you only see in the Gemara. Mashenkin and Sifri, whereas if you were to look in the Sifri, you wouldn't see this point. Yes, the Sifri does say that Yocheved is the one who gets kahuna in her family and Miriam royalty in her family. Kommt aber der Ihnen in Sifri als, but the Sifri frames it in a specific way. What's it? Araya. It's framed as proof of a principle the Sifri teaches. Anybody who draws close to the Eibishter through their dedication to Hashem, Hashem draws them close as well. The Sifri is not focusing on the fact that what the Eibishter gives a person is exactly perfectly calibrated to the details of what they did. The Sifri is talking in a very broad, generic sense about the person who comes close to the Eibishter gets something in return. And the way the Sifri presents it, it could apply to all good things that a person does. The Sifri actually quotes a whole lot of different possibilities. Here's a person who drew themselves close to the Eibishter, so the Eibishter drew them close too. Number 2, Nital Seinin from Beis Yisrael ala Yidden. Also, the way that the Sifri presents it is that something private that happened in Yocheved and Miriam's families, that Yocheved has Kohanim in her family and Miriam has royalty in her family, but doesn't speak about it in the context of the entire Jewish nation and the impact of on the entire Jewish nation. That's why you'll see the Sifri doesn't use the words that it was houses and legacies of Kahuna and Malchus. Because the Sifri is not focused on that point that they are given this massive legacy that would impact the entire Jewish people because they had created the possibility of an entire Jewish people. Rashi gives us an insight that even the Sifri didn't give us. And while we're analyzing the fact that Rashi quotes the Gemara Sota, that helps us answer another question in Rashi. The beginning of the pasuk is it starts off by telling us that the Yocheved and Miriam, the Meyaldos, the midwives, that they feared Hashem. So you would assume if you're looking for midah keneged midah, then what they did is showed fear of God, so they should have had a reward which is suited to fear of God, surely. And that's not what happens. Well, if you look at the Medrash that does believe that they were rewarded for the fear of God, it's a different reward. It's not families, it's not legacies. So the Medrash gives, based on a pasuk, gives us the insight that what does it mean that they should be rewarded for their fear of God? They were rewarded with access to Torah, or more specifically, because Yocheved had all of Hashem, Hamid Mimena Moshe, therefore she is the one who brought up Moshe, who is described as being good. And why is he called good? Because he becomes the agent who shares Torah with us, and Torah is also called good, a good lesson. And eventually the Torah is named for Moshe. As the pasuk says, Zichru Torahs Moshe Avdi. It doesn't say remember the Torah of God, it says remember the Torah of Moshe, my servant. Or Miriam, who also feared God, says the Medrash, Yatzam Mimena Betzalel. Her reward was to have a descendant, Betzalel, Shayamolei Chochma, who is filled with wisdom. As the pasuk says, that I will fill him with the Spirit of God. And part of his reward is that he was the person who built the Aron that would contain the ultimate source of Torah, the Luchos. In other words, the Medrash is saying they feared Hashem, and therefore the reward was associated with Torah, either Moshe, the giver of Torah, or Betzalel, who created the space to hold the Torah. Now, from a Pshat perspective, that actually seems to match really well. They feared Hashem. The pasuk tells us clearly that the objective of Torah is to do what Hashem wants and to fear God. So Torah is to get us to fear God. They feared God. It makes sense, according to Pshat, that the reward for their fear of Hashem is that they should have had descendants who brought Torah into the world. And of course, for Yocheved, that would be the most incredible reward, that she would have a son, Moshe, who brings Torah to the Jewish people. Surely this would have been a much better option for Rashi, because then the reward is in the same pasuk, right? The pasuk says, what's Rashi doing? Rashi's splitting it and saying, well, they feared Hashem, and then the reward comes at the end of the next pasuk, where that he gave them houses. Would be that Hashem did good to them Yaldas. Why? Because they feared Hashem, so he did good to them and gave them the agents of fear of Hashem, in other words, the people to bring Torah into the world. Why doesn't Rashi do that? Rashi tells us why he doesn't go down that route, because he's quoting the Gemara Sotah. In the Mishnah of Sugim Masechta Sotah is Mavordin from Mida Keneged Mida Nit Keneged Regesh V'Kavona Sa'adam. Because when you look in Sotah, you will see that piece of the Gemara tells us clearly that we are rewarded measure for measure, not for our intentions, not Keneged Ha'Maisa B'Foil, but for our actions. And that's clear in that entire Sugya. And the Inyan is Mudgashim Pshutoy Shal Mikra. That's something you can see in the simple understanding of the pasuk. In fact, Rashi has already told us much earlier in the story of Noach that you see Mida Keneged Mida affect behaviors. The meaning for Mida Keneged Mida Maisa B'Foil. What's the Rashi's comment? The people of the Dura Mabel sinned by doing mass crime or mass immoral behavior. So therefore, the way they were punished was mass deluge of water. In other words, Rashi's already illustrated to us this principle that Mida Keneged Mida speaks to actions, not intentions. On the Rebbe is a pipshut shemuk removen. So therefore, according to the simplest understanding of the pasuk, it makes sense as the hatova und the schar do is nit azoifel frazer kavona umachshava yoru esolekim. It's actually quite simple for us to understand that the reward Hashem is going to offer them is not really going to be directed at their state of mind, their emotional connection to Hashem, their fear of God, which is all in the world of intention. They're going to be rewarded for their actions, their choices. Seeing as they were midwives. Shifra was given her name because she helped to, clean up and unfold, so to speak, all the pieces when a baby is born and has to be kind of stretched out. And Pua was called Pua because she used to sing or hum or make noises to settle the baby. In other words, actions they took. And then they kept them alive. And Rashi says not only did they keep them alive, they made sure that they had everything that they needed so they could live the best way possible. And by doing that, their actions established the entire future of the Jewish people. So the reward for that is not really going to be that Yocheved has a child who's as of the caliber of Moshe Rabbeinu and brings the Torah to the Jewish people, or Miriam has a descendant Betzalel who's able to build the Aron. Because that can't be called a bias. A bias is something which lasts. Moshe was Moshe, but then on Masari Yeshua, he then transferred it to a different family, to Yeshua from a different Shevet. And the same with Betzalel. Betzalel, there's no longevity to being the architect of the Mishkan. It's a once-off thing. Now, the inyan from Batikuna Levil Malchus, that's why Rashi, using the insight from the Gemara Sotah, that a person is rewarded Mida Keneged Mida, and to all the details of Mida Keneged Mida, for their actions and behavior. Therefore, it's clear to Rashi that the impact has to be a lasting impact. It can't just be having a prodigious son or a descendant who builds the Mishkan. And this is a great illustration of how the different parts of Torah serve different purposes, and everyone is absolutely precise. And so we'll look at the difference between the Medrash, the Sifri, and Rashi, what they seek to achieve, and how it's illustrated in this particular commentary. You see, everything in Torah is absolutely perfect. Let's be honest. What was given to Yocheved and Miriam in reward for their dedication to the children and establishing the Jewish community, that's a medrash. So, right, it's a medrash. Yet depending which particular source you look at it from, it's going to be precise and different. Vidas is in Pirush Rashi and Gemara. There's the perspective of Rashi, which is similar to the Gemara. Vidas is in Medrash. There's the perspective of the Medrash, and Vidas is in Sifri. As a chilek is behesem to declonim gedolim from the chilek of Torah vud the inyan state. What's beautiful about this is the way that the information is shared is perfectly suited to the mandate of that particular part of Torah. In Medrash, the Medrash, the entire purpose of Medrash is to explain and expound the Torah. So the Gemara Shabbos tells us that the nature of Medrash is that it's very attractive, it draws a person in. It talks to the world of emotion. And the purpose of Medrash is it helps to enhance our fear of Hashem. So through the lens of Medrash, what is seen to be the greatest asset of Yocheved and Miriam that they fear the Eibishter, because that's what Medrash is all about. Building up this emotional attachment to Hashem and a sense of fear of God. Und der Rebbe is dorten mudgish the schar ma schar hayira Torah chulei. Therefore, from the perspective of Medrash, what's the reward we're looking for over here? Torah, which helps embellish or grow a person's fear of Hashem. In Sifri, although it technically belongs in the greater midrashic landscape, its purpose is was bika halachas. It's all about halacha lemaisa. Verbunden mit Meise. It's tethered to action. It's a scharanin sham Meise kuna malchus neged zer Meise. So therefore, from the perspective of Sifri, they did something, and therefore they're given people who have roles to do something. A kohen, a king. The Adgoshe Meises aber nicht der innen Proti von der Asiya Protis. But from the perspective of Sifri, it's the fact that you did an action that's more important than the details of what the action was. Now, the Tzadashava mit anderen Meisen mit Karavatz mit folgendem Eibishter. And therefore the Sifri says, you did an action to bring yourself close to Hashem, therefore the Eibishter gives you something of closeness in return. You could be his kohen, you could be his king. Rashi Pshuto Shel Mikra, whereas Rashi, who looks from the perspective of Pshat, was is verbunden mit Asiya Mamash. Pshat is the most action-oriented part of Torah. And you'll actually see a similar thing in the Gemara, because when the Gemara analyzes parts of the Torah, it actually takes a more Pshat approach. When you're learning from the Pshat perspective, you see that the darshaning and the expounding of Torah is not the main thing. The main thing is how will it translate into action. Was in them is in jedem Meisen again nicht lo ist der Tzadashava von alle Meisen Tovim. So if you're focused on action, then you can't just talk about actions in the most generic sense. Not the Teichem Proti von der Asiya Protis. The details of the particular action that you're taking are relevant. And what the impact of your actions will be, that's incredibly relevant. The Rebbe is done get the schar from botek malchus. That's why Rashi is not just looking for the fact that there would be a kohen in the family, a king in the family, but rather that they would be the legacy of kings, the legacy of kohanim. And he links it to a pasuk where the pasuk is actually talking about the physical structures of a palace and a Beis Hamikdash. Because Rashi identifies that the big thing that Yocheved and Miriam achieved was to actually bring Jewish families to life for real. Therefore, they're given a legacy for real. And from Rashi Anal Ben Aris Ironi Flaw, this is going to tell us an incredible lesson. The Cherena Chaname Azinu was Moshe is given there was nicht in Torah al Yode is nicht kemide connected mit the schar for Yocheved and Miriam. Okay, let's be technical for a second and say the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu would be the agent of Torah to the world is maybe not precise mide connected mide for Yocheved. Das doch aber for the greatest schar was we can haben, but surely as a Jewish mother, that's got to be the greatest reward that she could possibly dream of. Her child is going to be Hashem's representative of Torah. Is men do madgish as is don noch aggressor schar. That's why Rashi is telling us, there's an even greater reward than that. And therefore, nachas for a Jewish mother, there's a greater nachas than that her child is the greatest person in history. And what is that? Building something that is lasting, that affects numerous people, and brings value to the entire Jewish community. A Jewish mother's nachas is not that she has the smartest, most academic, most knowledgeable child of all. What gives a mother nachas is to establish Jewish legacy. Idische Kinder und Kindskinder. The fact that there be not just one child, but many children, and their children, and their children's children. Talmidim and Talmidim, many students and the students' students. Helping it to bein idische heimen. You know what's nachas for a Jewish mother? That her family is building the Jewish nation. To have children who are bringing the rest of the Jewish community into the conduct of Kohanim, Levim, and Malchus. Which means, what does it mean, such conduct? That means, yes, we know that Kohanim and Levim are typically removed or separated from the rest of the community so they could focus on serving Hashem. Zera Levi kulloi moved al Beis Hamikdash, as the expression goes, that the Rambam writes, that the whole scion of Levi, the whole family of Levi, they're completely separated from the community so that they can be totally dedicated to serving Hashem in the Beis HaMikdash. Is Ikka Havdalah by Koyanim, Baseitun, the Avodas HaKarbonos HaKetoros with Beis HaMikdash. There's no question that the most elite and the most aloof of the community are the Kahanim, because they have to be completely focused on bringing Karbonos, etc., doing the Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. As we know, a Kohen has to prevent themselves from becoming impure so they're not disqualified from doing their service. And they can't even leave Eretz Yisrael, certainly not when they're in service. So that those restrictions do not apply to a Levi. So what's the lesson for us in this? Every one of us, in the way that we serve Hashem, we have a Kohen element. The precious, the fact that we should stay away from the world, and be completely focused and connected to Hashem. That's a Kohen. But a Levi doesn't live completely connected to Hashem at all times. The Levi travels, goes outside of the holy environment, even goes into a cemetery. In other words, the Levi's focus is the Levi's job is to reach out and touch the Jew who's not in Israel, not in the Beis HaMikdash. As Chutzloretz, Bizan and Adarg from Beis HaKvaris. In fact, the Jew who might be so far that he's in the spiritual equivalent of a cemetery. In a spiritual state of not being as alive as one should. The Levi connects to that person and infuses enthusiasm and life into that person's Judaism. And the Levi has such an impact on this Jew who was so distant that this Jew becomes completely dedicated to Hashem like a Kohen or a Levi. But even a Levi is not enough, because a Levi is an attendant to a Kohen. The Levi's life does have to orbit around the Beis HaMikdash and helping the Kohanim in their avodah. So the Levi also has limitations on how much impact he could have on the world. Even though the Levi has the freedom to be able to travel, he's always linked back to a place of holiness. The ultimate goal and purpose, and this is the ultimate Yiddish nachas, is to have people who are like kings. They bring Hashem's authority, Hashem's rule to the entire world. Dos is the emes nachas for Yiddish mama hot. That's the ultimate nachas for a Jewish mother. When her legacy is people, children, grandchildren who serve Hashem in all three channels: Kohen, Levi, Melech. And that forges the army that will lead us out of this current Golus. Just like it was in Mitzrayim, that by building such a generation, they became Hashem's army who could leave Mitzrayim. They got out of Mitzrayim. How? Because they were built up, they were founded, they were initiated by the Miyaldos, by the midwives. Over Roisha Moshe, who led them? Moshe by Bishur Melech, who's like a king. And Aaron, who is HaKoyen. V'shiftam Shevet Levi, and the rest of the Shevet that Aaron and Moshe belonged to, which is Shevet Levi, on Yotzim B'Yad Ramah, they led the Jewish people out with an upraised hand, with a sense of victory, with a sense of confidence. Came to Yelonu, the same thing should apply. It's Hashem that we are able to produce children who lead the Yidden out of Golus as Moshe and Aaron did then.